There's more ways than one to get lost on the back roads out there. I almost found that out the hard way. I was with my college sweetheart at the time, Lisa. We both had a few years in the workforce after graduating, and we were already burnt out. If there was a Resilience 101 course in college, we would have failed spectacularly. She was working as an accountant at the time, and I had just quit my job as a civil engineer. You know what would cheer us up? Never having to work again. The Great American Road Trip. I agreed to it, of course. It seemed like a good idea. I mean, how many people don't dream about driving across the United States in an open car? We were barely out of Sacramento when we reached the edge of the Mojave. I'd actually never had driven out of the state up to that point, so I was lost. I stopped at an isolated gas station. I told Lisa that I needed to use the restroom, but it was really because I had no idea where we were going. I got out of the car and told Lisa I was going to the restroom, but I walked behind the station where the men's bathroom was and whipped out my phone. I couldn't let Lisa know that I got us lost. I had no job. I couldn't let her know I was so hopeless that we were lost in this day and age. I looked down at the bars. Empty. There was no reception out there. We really were lost. I went in to buy water, but really to ask for directions. There was only one person there, a balding middle-aged man reading one of the magazines of the stand. It was a small gas station, 1 fridge for bottled water and Coke, 2, even if you want to be generous, aisles full of corn chips and bags of nuts. Suffice to say, the gas station only made its money from desperate travelers on an empty tank. I handed over the cash and in my best casual tone, I went, "So, you wouldn't know the roads to Tucson, would you?" The gas attendant smirked. "Lost, huh? No phone reception? You'd think in this day and age, right?" He smirked again. "Go about 50 miles straight ahead and take the right on the fork. You'll go down off the highway, but it's a shortcut to Tucson. Keep going straight for 20 miles and you'll join the highway again. Saves you 6 hours. Thanks, mister." I hopped back into the car and checked Lisa's legs resting on the dashboard. Damn, I was a lucky bastard. "You got lost and asked for directions, didn't you?" She had seen right through me. "I tried my phone first. I couldn't get reception either. So where we headed?" 50 miles straight and then right on the fork." "Right on, cowboy." I have to admit, Lisa was right making me go on this trip. With the wind blowing through our hair, vistas on the horizon, it made me feel like we were carefree and back in college. We finally reached the fork. "Right?" Lisa said. "Right." We turned right, and the cactus-filled deserts actually started to be filled with trees and shrubs. A few miles on, and there was tall grass on either side of the road. I guess cacti weren't the only things growing out here. A few more miles and we turned a corner. It was just 60 yards ahead before I screeched to a stop. There was a car across the road, and what looked like to be 2 bodies out on the road, just laying there. "I think they're dead," Lisa said, covering her mouth in horror. I leaned over the dashboard, as if a few extra inches was supposed to provide more clarity. "Should we call an ambulance?" I asked Lisa. "Of course we should." She whipped out her phone. "Crap," she said. "Still no reception." She dropped her phone and turned to me. "We have to go help them. We can't just leave them there." "Yeah, of course. Right." I started the car again and only went a few yards before I stopped. I looked at the road ahead of us. There was 2 bodies, the car across both lanes of the road, and long, tall grass on either side. But there was no signs of an accident. The car was in perfect shape, no shattered glass. Even though we were 60 yards away, the bodies didn't look mangled or bloody. I just stared. "What are you doing? Drive! We have to help them!" Lisa was almost hysterical. I just kept staring. I had the worst feeling. "Doesn't this seem strange to you?" I asked Lisa. To this day, she has never given me as filthy as a look as she did that day. "The only thing that is strange is that you're not driving." "But how did they get there? Their car doesn't even look damaged. It's almost like it's blocking the road. I'd have to go partially off the road to get around it." She was almost incredulous now. "Then don't drive around them. Help them." "Lisa, I'm going to drive slowly around them. I'll get on the other side, and if everything's okay, we'll get out and help." That has to be the dumbest thing I've ever heard. We stared at each other in silence for a few moments before I turned on the car again. I kept the car at a really slow speed. 40 yards away, the seam came into better view. There may have been a few scratches on the car, but it definitely wasn't damaged. When we were 20 yards away, I saw no glass, nothing, just two perfectly healthy bodies laying on the road, a man and a woman. I looked over to Lisa. She looked at me. "Keep driving," she ordered. We reached the bodies on the road. They were a perfectly healthy man and woman. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the tall grass shaking, and my instincts kicked in. I floored it and nearly crashed my car myself. In a few seconds, I had reached the other side, and through the rearview mirror, I could see the man and woman lying on the road. Stand up. They looked right at us. In astonishment, I stopped the car. Lisa and I were just stunned. The man yelled out, "Hey, come back here!" And that's when it became downright terrifying. There was one man who stepped out of the tall grass on the side of the road, then two women on the other side. Before we knew it, there were about 40 people on that road, around that car, all of whom had walked out of the tall grass. I sat there with a lump in my throat. I could never even begin to know what I just avoided. Why these people pretended to be dead. What these 40 or so people would have done to us if we stopped and got out of the car. Then they started taunting us, waving their arms at us. I was so disoriented that I drove off as fast as I could. I'm pretty sure I broke the land speed record. I was driving that fast. We got off the road and back onto the main highway. Lisa and I didn't speak the entire time until we reached the first small town we could find. We told the sheriff and pleaded with him to stop those people, whoever they were. The sheriff shrugged his shoulders and checked it out, but found nothing. No people, no car. We filed a report with the FBI, but we haven't heard back. So, I'm just writing this to tell you to be careful. The Great American Road Trip is something we all dream about, but there are roads out there that, well, I just don't want to think about what could have happened that day. I work as a cell tower technician. You've probably seen videos on YouTube of some guy clinging to the top of a metal tower in the middle of a huge empty nothing. That's me. It's about the best job you can get where I live without a high school diploma, and the only real source of entertainment to boot. As a perpetual screw-up with an appetite for adrenaline, I was basically a star candidate. Really, the only two requirements are a basic level of physical conditioning and a complete lack of fear, both of which I have. Or, at least I thought I did. 2 weeks ago, the company I worked for, who shall remain unnamed lest the corporate overlords find this post, sent me out to a job site about 50 miles out of town. Rarely do I have to cross state lines, but the tower in question was about as far out of the way as it gets. Big one, too. 400 some odd feet, meant to bounce signals all the way across the Appalachian Mountains from one sleepy mining town to the next. That suited me fine. I prefer working where prying eyes won't see me for one reason: base jumping. For the uninitiated, base jumping entails throwing yourself off a big object with a parachute on. You know, when you jump off the roof of your house as a 10-year-old with a blanket and broke your ankle and your stepdad came out and beat you with a belt before he drove you to the hospital. No? Maybe it's just me. Anyhow, base jumping is basically the grown-up version of that, minus the broken ankle and the beating. Hopefully. Luckily for me, secluded cell towers happen to be the perfect place for this kind of hobby. The morning I was supposed to head out there was a fine mist sinking down into the hollers where I lived. The locals call it moonshine weather, which translate to stay the hell inside and get drunk instead of go to work. As tempted as I was to do just that, I'd been hoping they'd send me out that way for months. I should have trusted my gut. Instead, I brewed myself a shitty thermos of coffee, threw the gear into the back of my shitty Jeep, and, well, you get the idea. I drove a few hours out to the site, fooling myself all the way that the weather would clear up soon, and it would be a sunny climb to the top. I'd packed my parachute along with my other gear. I used to bring a GoPro along until I realized that recording the sort of behavior that would give an OSHA rep an aneurysm probably isn't smart. I can be smart when I remember to. Anyway, I parked my Jeep outside the fence around the tower and typed the code into the electronic gate. Someone had strung razor wire over the top of it, but I doubted anyone visited much, and the wire was crumbling in places. I figured anyone who really wanted to wouldn't find it hard to bypass. My suspicions were confirmed as I drove past the tiny maintenance shed sitting on the corner of the lot and found every inch of the corrugated metal covered in graffiti. I admired it as I opened the padlock and retrieved one of the bulbs from inside. The work order said this tower needed an aircraft warning light replaced. You know, those blinking red lights that let you know there's a giant tower out there in the dark. I took one from a dusty shelf, tucked it into my rucksack, threw on my climbing rig, checked my chute one last time, and started the climb. The start of the climb is always boring. One hand over the other, rung by rung. You're almost impatient waiting for that thrill that comes with dangling hundreds of feet above the earth. Or, at least I was. But you have to pace yourself. A fall from 30 feet can just be as fatal as a fall from 400. And if I was going to go out, I knew which one I'd rather take. Most of the time you'll see tower climbers clipping a carabiner to each rung to fasten themselves in place as they go. I don't bother with that unless it's a windy day, and it wasn't. In fact, the air seemed unnaturally still as I climbed. If I was a wiser man, I might have paid more attention to the prickle at the back of my neck, or the sense of foreboding in my gut. But, as you probably guessed, I'm not, so I didn't. Instead, I chalked it up to the coffee jitters and doubled my pace. Probably just needed to take a leak. Have you ever pissed off a 400-foot-tall object? It's just as awesome as it sounds. I was around halfway up when I realized that the fog around me had grown more dense rather than less, which was strange. Usually, when you get a bit of height and the sun starts to burn away the mist, you can see just fine. Typically, it's all gone by 2 p.m., leaving you free and clear to jump from the top. I'd already picked out a nice little meadow to the southeast of the tower, where I could land and have an easy hike back to the Jeep. If I couldn't see it, though, that would be a problem. I'm not suicidal after all. It looked like my dreams were shattered for the day. The fog around me was so dense now that if I hadn't known better, I would have thought a storm was rolling in. But the weather forecast hadn't mentioned any chance of a storm, and there was still no wind. It was strangely silent, except for the dulling ring of my boots on the rungs and my own breath in my ears. I paused to take a break around halfway up. There are altitude markers painted on the cell tower so you can mark how far you've come, and I'd just passed 150 feet. Clipping a carabiner onto the rung above me for the first time that day, I leaned back and stretched, enjoying the feeling of weightlessness. I glanced down, something the veteran climbers tell you to never do, and that's when I saw it. Down below me, shrouded in mist, a shape clung to the side of the tower. I say shape because I didn't get a clear look at it. Just a shadow, maybe 100 feet below. So far away that I couldn't really even tell if it was moving. The heck? Now, I know I'm not Shakespeare, but I doubted old Bill would have reacted any differently than I did. I mean, why would anyone be climbing a cell tower in backwoods Appalachia on a day like this? Anyone besides me, that is. My first thought was that if one of the graffiti artists, who, finding their skills limited by the canvas of the old maintenance shed, had grown the balls to climb the tower and add a little color to the gray steel. Good on them. Might make for a bit of an awkward meeting when they caught up to me, but I wasn't about to call the cops or anything. I even debated hanging around until they got a little closer, but decided against it. That was my first and only good decision that day. Probably the one that saved my life. I kept climbing, reasoning that if my fellow climber made it to the top while I was still around, I'd congratulate them on their courage and ask them nicely to paint over one of the lights so that the company would send me out here in a month or two and I could get my jump on. I reached the 200-foot mark and took another break, feeling the cool wet air on my cheek. scratching under my thick beanie. The company tells you to wear a helmet, but I figured that at heights like this, I'd prefer my cranium to liquefy on impact if I fall. Quick and painless. I took another look down to see how my mysterious friend was doing. It was closer. I say it because it took my brain a few seconds to register that the thing climbing up the tower towards me wasn't human. It had closed the distance between us by a few dozen feet, and it was impossible to mistake. Its arms were too long, its body too short. I caught a glimpse of dark glistening skin through the mist, a face twisting on a knobbly neck, two eyes that were as pale as milk white, like an old man's cataracts. I blinked. It was still there. One arm swung over the other with an unnatural grace, a hand large enough to swallow the entire rung curling around steel. The heck? Once more and with feeling. Now, I'm not superstitious, or religious, or philosophical, or political, or really anything at all. I'm a monkey-brained tower climber, and when I saw the thing that was following me up the tower, my monkey brain took right over. I scurried up the rungs, throwing caution to the wind, my brain trying to account for what I was seeing. Some kind of prank, a TV show, right? With an absolute insane budget? A dozen half-hearted attempts to reason flew through my mind, each one as pathetic as the last. I climbed up until I was out of breath, and my mind, looking for an excuse and coming up empty, swung back around to, did I really just see that? I risked a glance down. The thing was still below me, and gaining. It climbed in eerie silence, not growling or snarling like a wild animal. Just the quiet, fluid determination of predators stalking prey. I caught a flash of movement, of a snub-nosed face, of naked skin and a mouth full of black teeth. I'd given an old meth head some change once, and she'd flashed me a rotten grin full of teeth like that. There was only one way down now, and that was up. I climbed as quickly as I could, throwing caution to the wind. The 300-foot mark passed in a blur. 350. I was starting to flag, every breath burning in my lungs. I could taste copper in my mouth, and my eyes were blurry. I started to get clumsy. I missed a rung with my foot almost falling. I clung there, terrified I would feel the long fingers close around my foot. I kicked the rung once, then managed to get my boot back into place and kept going. I reached the tower's uppermost platform. The trap door was locked, secured by a padlock. Of course it was locked. I tore a glove off with my teeth and let it spiral away, fumbling in my pocket for the key. Nothing. My entire body was seizing with fear. The piss I'd been saving for the top of the tower was running down my leg. I unhooked the hammer on my tool belt and bashed the padlock. It came open, bouncing off my arm. I shoved open the door and hauled myself through, landing on the small platform at the top like a trout from a creek. Through the grates I could see the thing right below me. It opened its mouth, jaw cracking to reveal a mouth that was too wide. Inside that mouth was another mouth, and another and another. I screamed. Well, I did my best with whatever air was left in my lungs. It sounded more like a whimper or a sob. I stood with my back to the top of the tower, watching as it moved half-hidden below me. I slung one leg over the railing at the edge of the platform and checked the straps of my parachute. The sky was gray in every direction, nothing but endless mind-numbing gray. Looking back, I feel as though I should have had at least some idea of where the sun was, but there was nothing, just an endless field of twilight. I couldn't tell which direction I was facing, or where the meadow I planned to land in could be. I'd be jumping blind into the fog, no idea of where I was headed, or how even close I was to the earth. It was insane. It was my only option. As the creature lifted one glistening arm over the edge of the tower, ready to haul itself up after and grab me, I threw myself off. Normally, this is where I let out a whoop, revel in the feeling of wind on my face, the weightlessness. This time, though, I fell in silence, eyes full of freezing tears as the cold wind scoured my skin and hair. I had a pair of goggles slung around my neck to shield my face, but I'd forgotten to pull them up. I seized the ripcord and pulled for all I was worth. There was a reassuring snap of nylon against air, followed by a bowel-loosening tug, and my feet kicked out in front of me. Thankfully, instinct took over, giving my overtaxed brain a break. I glanced up and over my shoulder, wind whistling in my ears, but I could see no sign of the creature above me. I hauled on the steering lines, straining to see any sign of the ground below. There was nothing. A few long moments passed, then I caught sight of a tree spearing through the mist. Another followed, then another, and then I was sailing between them, branches slapping my face, battering my arms and legs. I flew free of the trees and straight into the side of the fence at the base of the tower, razor wire slashing my hands as I struck the top of the fence with enough force to knock the wind out of me. I fell backward, landing in the dirt, shredded nylon blowing down to cover my face. I struggled free from the remains of my chute and unbuckled the pack, leaving it all in a heap by the fence. I limped for my Jeep. Above I could see no sign of the creature. I hauled the door open and started the engine, praying that the faulty spark plug I'd been meaning to replace for months would do me this one last solid. The engine sputtered to life. Something flew overhead, a blur. I caught sight of long limbs spread wide, of membranous wings billowing in the sky. Eyes locked on mine as the predator glided silently overhead, banking, turning towards me. I threw the Jeep into reverse, tires spinning in loose dirt. My head bounced off the headrest as I crashed through the gate. Then I was off, jostling down the gravel-packed road. I didn't stop driving until I reached home. Autopilot must have kicked in because I drove myself to the ER. They must have thought I was some kind of crazy person, wide-eyed, pants soaked with piss. They had to peel my fingers from the bloody steering wheel before they could get me inside. It's been 2 weeks now, and the stitches across my arms and hands are only just healing. I'll have the scars for the rest of my life. I'm writing this with the doors locked, and my stepdad's old 12-gauge leaned against the desk next to me. I should get a dog. Maybe 2. The mist is back, and somehow the mountains just don't seem as safe as they used to. The screen on my phone just lit up. A text from the company. Another job. Another site. I don't think I'll answer. My wife, Emily, has always been a sleepwalker. We'd been married for 10 years, and I had grown used to finding her standing in the hallway or rummaging through the kitchen in the middle of the night. It was unnerving, but ultimately harmless. However, over the past month, her sleepwalking had taken a sinister turn. It started with small things, like finding knives placed on the edge of our bed or dead birds on the kitchen counter. I initially brushed it off, thinking maybe she found the birds outside and, in her sleepwalking state, had brought them in. But as weeks passed, the incidents grew increasingly more disturbing. One morning, I woke up to find Emily sitting on the floor next to the bed, her eyes glazed over and her hands covered in blood. I felt my stomach twist as I frantically searched her body for injuries, but there were none. Instead, I found the mutilated corpse of a stray cat lying beside her. "Emily, wake up!" I shouted, shaking her. Her eyes fluttered open and she gasped, staring at the gruesome sight. What happened?" she whispered, horror in her voice. I think you did this while sleepwalking," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to get you help." That very day, we went to see a specialist, Dr. Martin, a renowned sleep disorder expert, ran a series of tests, and prescribed medication to help Emily stay asleep throughout the night. It seemed to work for a while, but then one night, things took an even darker turn. I awoke in the middle of the night to find Emily standing over me, holding a knife to my throat. Her eyes were blank, devoid of emotion. "Emily, please wake up," I begged, trying to remain calm. "I'm sorry, dear," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "But I have to do this." My heart raced as I tried to think of something, anything to say that might snap her out of it. Emily, it's me, your husband. We've been together for 10 years. You don't want to hurt me. For a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes, and she lowered the knife. But it was quickly replaced by the same eerie blank stare. It's not my choice, she said. They demand it. Who? Who demands it? I asked desperately. She tilted her head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The voices, she replied. They won't let me rest until I do their bidding. I managed to subdue her that night, but I was terrified. I couldn't go on living in fear that my own wife would kill me in her sleep. The next day, we returned to Dr. Martin. I told him about the incident and the voices Emily had mentioned. Sleepwalking is often accompanied by hallucinations and vivid dreams, Dr. Martin explained. It's possible that Emily is experiencing these voices as part of her sleepwalking episodes. I can adjust her medication and recommend therapy to help her manage the stress that might be triggering these episodes. We followed Dr. Martin's advice, but nothing seemed to help. I even began sleeping in a separate room, locking the door for my own safety. But one night, I woke up to the sound of something pounding on the door. Please, let me in! Emily screamed. They're coming for me! I hesitated, unsure if this was another sleepwalking episode, or if she was genuinely awake and terrified. But something in her voice convinced me to unlock the door, and as soon as I did, Emily burst into the room, her eyes wide with fear. She locked the door behind her and collapsed into my arms sobbing. They were in the living room, she gasped. Shadow figures with red eyes. They told me that if I didn't do their bidding, they'd hurt you. I tried to comfort her, but I could feel my own fear creeping in. This was no ordinary sleepwalking episode. Something was very, very wrong. The next day, we went to see a psychic, hoping to find answers that science couldn't provide. The psychic, Madame Zara, listened intently as we recounted our experiences. You're being haunted by malevolent entities, she said gravely. They're using Emily's sleepwalking as means to control her and force her to do their bidding. We must perform a cleansing ritual to remove their influence. We agreed, willing to try anything to rid ourselves of this nightmare. That evening, Madame Zara arrived at our home, armed with candles, incense, and other tools of her trade. She instructed us to sit in a circle on the living room floor while she performed the ritual. As she chanted and burned the incense, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. The air grew heavy, and I could feel a sinister presence pressing in on us. Suddenly, the candles flickered, and the room went cold. Emily gasped, her eyes darting around the room. They're here, she whispered. Stay strong, Madame Zara urged. They will fight, but we can drive them away. As the ritual went on for hours, the tension in the room grew palpable. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, the weight of the room seemed to intensify rather than lift. Madame Zara's chanting grew more desperate, beads of sweat forming on her brow. Suddenly, she gasped and collapsed to the floor, her eyes wide with terror. I can't do it, she stammered. Their power is too great. They're resisting my every effort to banish them. Emily and I exchanged panicked glances, unsure of what to do next. The shadowy figures with red eyes seemed to be everywhere, their sinister laughter echoing through the room. It was clear that they were not going to let us go so easily. In the weeks that followed, Emily's sleepwalking and violent incidents grew worse. The sinister presence in our home was stronger than ever, and no matter how many specialists we consulted or rituals we attempted, nothing seemed to make a difference. It was as if the entities had latched onto us, refusing to let go. I began to fear for my own safety and for Emily's sanity. I moved out of our home and into a small apartment, hoping that the distance might weaken the entity's hold on her, but it was to no avail. Emily continued to spiral into darkness, the voices in their commands growing more insistent and malevolent with each passing day. We tried everything, but it was clear that there was no way to win this battle. The entities had taken control, and they were determined to keep their grip on Emily, using her as a vessel for their evil intentions. It was as if our love and our lives had become a twisted game for them, one that we seemed destined to lose. In the end, Emily was institutionalized. Her sleepwalking incidents became violent attacks on the staff and other patients. I visited her every day, desperate to see some glimmer of the woman I loved. But it was like staring into the eyes of a stranger. The woman I had married was gone, replaced by something dark and sinister. As I sat by her side, holding her cold, unresponsive hand, I couldn't help but feel defeated. The entities had won, and we had lost everything. Our love, our home, our lives, all destroyed by a force we could neither understand nor defeat. I grieved for Emily, for myself, and for the life we had once shared. Now a distant memory, overshadowed by the darkness that had consumed us.